Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Canon EOS R6. Now this camera has been out for only a couple of years, and of course it's nowhere as old as pretty much most of the other DSLRs or mirrorless cameras that I talk about on my channel, but this camera has been one of my main cameras that I use alongside my Canon EOS R5 and also the original Canon EOS R. And to be honest, this camera never really let me down, and it's just a really nice, perfect camera in a lot of cases for me personally. And because there's so many in-depth reviews videos already out there, I'm just making a little disclaimer here that just like all of my other my thought videos on the cameras, it's only based on how I shoot with this camera. I just wanted to make this clear, because if you're looking for like reviews, this is not it. This is just me telling you my opinion, my thought based on how I shoot this camera, on how I use it, and why it would be beneficial to the way I would use it in case it might actually help some of you guys out. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon EOS R6, now this camera, despite only being out for a couple of years, and it's nowhere as old as pretty much most of my other DSLRs and mirrorless cameras that I talk about on my channel, but it is still a great camera in my opinion, especially when the price is decreasing both on the brand new and on the secondhand front, because this camera is pretty much still a camera that does everything very nicely and also deliver it very well. So of course, something like 20 megapixel might not sound a lot, and of course, some of the features might sound a little bit dated, but in the same time, you know, for the price and for the capability and especially the reliability of this camera, it's still worth considering. And just like any of my other My Thought videos, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections. So the first one is about the ergonomics and the operational side of things of this camera, and then I'll go into the image quality for both photography and video, and then I'll lead into my conclusion why I still recommend this camera. Now of course, let's first get on with the first section, which is the ergonomics and the operational side of things of this camera. Now this camera, to me, it feels really much very comfortable in hand. So it is bigger than the EOS R, but it is still very comfortable, the grip and everything. You know how like some grip, for example my A7 IV that's filming me right now, the grip is just, it's nicer than something like the A7 II, A7 III, but in the same time, if you're working with this camera, the A7 IV, for a long time, it doesn't feel great in hands. Whereas with this camera, the grip and everything, it just feels really great in hands. At least that's very subjective to how I use, because I shoot a lot of portraits and I use a lot of the 50-1.2, the 28-70 f2 and the 85-1.2, those lenses, and it just balances it with this grip really nicely, and also with the weight of the camera as well. Now this camera actually also feels very solid. Of course, if you're watching a lot of my DSLR videos like the 1DX, the 5D Mark III, the 5D Mark IV, yes, I heard a lot of complaints from you guys that this grip feels like a toy, and even the EOS R feels even more like a toy. But to be honest with you, like over a long period of time, even though it doesn't feel, you know, as big, as tough as the 1DX, but it still feels very solid. And even if you're working for a long period of time, it will be, you know, comfortable enough to still hold. It doesn't feel slippery, and it doesn't feel like you're gonna drop this camera at any moment, which is really nice. And if you're just like me, coupling it with like some of the heavier lenses, well, I would say the 85-1.2 and this 28-70mm f2 are heavy lenses for me personally, and for a long period of time, and still being able to hold them comfortably. That really says a lot about the grip and also the balance of this camera. Now overall, this like other section of the camera, it also feels very nice and solid, whether it's the dial back here or the dials up here or even the mode dial up here. Everything feels very solid, yet in the same time it feels very nice to turn. So it's not feeling like you can flip them or you really have to put pressure on them. It feels just right in my opinion. And this goes the same with all the other button layout as well. So unlike some other cameras, like for example the Canon EOS 70D, 80D, 90D, where the buttons doesn't always feel nice, especially in winter when you're wearing gloves, you don't really feel if it's confirmed or not. But with the EOS R6, all the button layouts are actually very efficiently arranged, first of all, but also they feel very tactile, and also it feels very nice to actually hit, and you know that you actually hit them. The only like nitpick I can actually nitpick about this camera is the buttons are a little bit too small if you're wearing one of those really thick gloves. So if you live here in Northern Europe and if you're like in the middle of winter where you actually have to wear really thick gloves, it can be a little bit hard to press because you're wearing thick gloves. But of course, if your gloves are just normal size, you will be able to hit all of these buttons and control all of these dials, joystick really nicely. Talking about the joystick, I thought that I would miss not having the joystick on the EOS R, and now that it's back on like the R5 and the R6, apparently I don't use it as much because, for example, if I'm zooming into the pictures, I would just use the touchscreen, which is actually very convenient. If I'm just focusing in the live view or just trying to compose an image, yeah, there is the actual screen here that I can just tap to focus, or just when I bring my eye up to the viewfinder, I actually just used the screen to just kind of move the autofocusing points around, which is actually much quicker than just using the joystick. So it just becomes kind of like a spot where I, to be honest, really miss the touch bar up here on the EOS R. I know it sounds weird, but to be honest, with how useful the Canon touchscreen interface is, it makes the touch bar much more useful to have on this camera than a joystick. That is just my opinion. But otherwise, yeah, this camera actually has a very weird build design, well, at least to me, simply because my Canon EOS RP, which is back here, it's magnesium alloy, and this is just posh plastic. And I get why they put posh plastic on here. I know there's a scientific name for it, but I just call it, you know, posh plastic because it is, well, it doesn't feel cheap and it's really tough, but in the same time, they could actually just put magnesium alloy if it's already on the RP and, you know, on the EOS R5 as well as on the EOS R, why not on the R6 as well? But yeah, it's just posh plastic. That's just something that I kind of feel weird. Of course, I never really have a failure with the or bad experience with the plastic build quality on this camera, but it's just something that I kind of wish that it would be magnesium alloy instead of plastic. But that's just me as well. But otherwise, the build quality is very tough and the weather sealing is also very tough as well. I have put this camera through so many weather conditions, whether it's the snowstorm or the rainstorm or just, you know, out and about shooting in weird hot weather, things like that. And yeah, this camera just proved to survive. It didn't let any sand, any dust, any rain, any snow into the camera. So yeah, that's really good. And yeah, another weird thing about this camera that I find weird is the screen. Of course, the screen itself is really good. The refresh rate is also really nice, and you can actually see the screen within like bright sunlight-ish. Here in Northern Europe, you can really see the screen like within bright sunlight really fine. But of course, if you're in like tropical countries like Thailand, you might actually have to shield the screen a little bit. But where I find it quite weird is the screen size itself. The screen size is actually smaller than the screen size on the EOS R and the EOS R5. And for the price, I was like, okay, why can't you just, you know, put a tiny bit bigger screen on this camera? Of course, in practice, I don't really see a huge difference, but in the same time, in terms of value for money, of course, I'm contradicting myself about the value of money from the introduction. But when it comes to the screen, I just find it, yeah, at least you can just put that bit bigger screen on there, make it as big as the R5 or at least the R. But it is usable. The refresh rate is good. The contrast rate is also, well, the contrast ratio rather, it's also really nice. The color accuracy is also really good. And yeah, no complaints on that front right there. Also, the LCD viewfinder in here, well, the actual electronic viewfinder in there also has a very nice refresh rate. It's much more improved than the R. And yeah, you can actually use it in real world, especially if you're photographing portraits or a lot of fast moving subjects. You can actually rely on the electronic viewfinder in here to actually give you almost real-time movement. Of course, with every single electronic viewfinders out there, there's no such thing as, you know, real-time like the optical viewfinder as many other people are also used to, but it is pretty much almost there. And yeah, the color accuracy, the corner sharpness are also very good and well controlled in this camera, well, through the electronic viewfinder right here, which is also very nice. And overall, on the side here, even though these ports for me feels a little bit flimsy and too thin compared to the DSLR counterpart, but to be honest, it never really let me down. It doesn't allow in any of the water that, you know, I shoot in rain or in snowstorm. It just doesn't allow any of the water to get in through these little thin gaskets. It's also very nicely sealed inside, but it's also very nicely organized. So what I always complain about some of these Sony cameras is that they have separate microphone and headphone compartments, whereas with this one it's pretty much in the same flap, which is really good. And for those who like to do a lot of time lapse or just shoot a lot with remotes, I really love how there's a separate remote port right here, which is really nice. Though I really wish that it would be more of like one of those remote port that the 5D Mark III has, or even the EOS R5 has down here. You know, like, you know, since this camera costs this much anyway, there's just no reason to just put this remote port there. But that's just me nitpicking, because I love using that particular remote from Canon more than the standard remote that you'd find on this port. But yeah, moving on to the next port is the typical USB-C, the digital out port, well, HDMI. The only thing I hate about this is it's micro HDMI. It's not full-size HDMI. So yeah, I know you probably heard a lot of complaints about it already, but that's just something I would like to cover, because personally I also use this HDMI port quite often, and it just gets disconnected very easily because it's micro HDMI. It's not full-size HDMI, and that can actually be a deal breaker to many of you guys, I know. And to me, it's not a deal breaker, but it's just one of those annoying factors that I wish that, you know, they would have implemented in the more standard size HDMI, because they actually do have the space for it, evidently speaking. Anyway, moving on to the front, which is actually quite plain. What I really love about this camera is that, yes, the shutter curtain does close down if you actually change lenses when the camera is switched off, things like that, which is actually pretty good. And you can also customize this button right here, the depth of field preview button. But yeah, to me, I just leave it as depth of field preview button, because to be honest, there are already more than enough buttons out here at my fingertips that I actually crucially would assign them to do things. And also because of how nice the touchscreen implementation on Canon cameras are, it's also very quick to just change any settings on here should I wish to do so while shooting. So there's that. And then moving on to this side, this camera has 2 SD card slots, which I personally quite like, because, well, to be honest, I prefer CF Express and SD card, because I don't like SD cards, but at least it's quite nice that it is a dual card slot, especially for the price. And now moving on to the next point, which is the battery life. The battery life on this camera is actually quite nice. Of course, it's not the best in the world. It's not the best amongst its competition, but in the same time, you can really get a lot of work done. I mean, I've been out shooting several days already, shooting at different jobs, and to be honest, it's been surviving on just one battery, and I don't know how it does it, but it seems to be actually, especially with the newer firmware update, a bit more efficient with the battery, because I remember when it first came out, I would have to switch through like around 2 or 3 batteries after like 2 days of shooting. But with this, after 2 or 3 days of shooting, I am still using one battery, albeit it is at its pretty much last percentage. But it just goes to show like how much more powerful this camera has become through different firmware updates as well, even though Canon never really highlight that from the beginning. Or maybe it's also just me who's used to using this camera over the period of time and know when to actually shut this camera off and when to actually use this camera to maximize its power capacity, things like that. Maybe it's just, you know, subconscious thing, but I think it's also more to do with the actual firmware update as well. And now moving on to another feature that this camera has that not a lot of people really mention, but it's the flash sync speed. Now, me in high school would really love to hear it, but you know, me now not using it, well, not using this feature as much because I don't shoot with flashes or strobes as much, is, well, this camera can actually go up to 250th of a second flash sync speed. Now, this is much better than the standard between 100 and 160 to 200 of a second flash sync speed. Now, of course, it doesn't sound all that much, but just being able to go up from, let's say, 160th of a second or even 200th of a second to 250th of a second, it does actually give you so much room for creativity and for different kind of strobes and flash usage. So I'm really pleased to just, you know, hear that or see that on here should someday I want to shoot with flashes or strobes. Now, this camera is also not a slow camera by any means. It shoots at 12 frames per second mechanically and also able to shoot 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. Now, personally, I always leave it at mechanical shutter, as many of you can probably hear from my photo shoot videos. I'm not there yet at trusting electronic shutter, albeit it is good from shooting at different kind of environment, different kind of scenarios. It's really good. The sensor readout is really nice. The processor is also fast enough to just process a lot of these images really nicely as well. But, you know, there's always that just in case moment, like just in case I'm shooting with some sort of artificial light, just in case I'm shooting with fast moving subject, or some of the subjects behind my subject happen to be moving really quickly. I just want to eliminate like any possible potential flaw within the image as possible. So I just stick to the mechanical shutter. And also using the mechanical shutter is really nice for me because it gives me that tactile feeling that, you know, I'm actually shooting something, because I don't like the virtual sound that it makes, even though I actually tend to turn that off. But it's also, well, talking about sound, it also is quiet enough that it doesn't really interfere with my surrounding environment. So let's say if I'm just shooting portraits out and about on the streets of, let's say, Amsterdam, Berlin, Bangkok, Tokyo, what have you, usually the noise on the street or the outdoor noise is just loud enough that people around me don't really hear the shutter, apart from me, you know, hearing it, or the cameras would hear it and record it, therefore you guys would hear it as well. But otherwise, normal people walking passing me wouldn't hear the shutter sound anyway, because the street sound would already be very loud enough. And if I'm taking pictures of concerts, of events, the shutter sound is also very soft, and it's also very nice and also very quiet, that it doesn't distract all the other audiences behind me or all the other people within that conference. So yeah, they all barely hear anything anyway because of how soft the sound is and also how quiet the sound is. And talking about the softness, if you're taking pictures, let's say handheld with a bit of long shutter speed, because of the soft shutter curtain sound and also the overall soft shutter curtain itself movement, it's very soft. It actually allows you to balance yourself much better and also come back with a much sharper and stable image anyway when shooting a little bit of a long exposure. Not too long, of course, just long enough for handheld. And couple that with the IBIS in this camera, which is actually very strong and very effective as well. I was able to really get by with a lot of events without having to use that tripod or monopod, or even photographing portraits in such low lighting situations without having to, you know, raise up the ISO, because I can actually afford to use a little bit of a slower shutter speed, whether it's using the 85mm lens, which is bloody heavy, or the 70 to 200, or even the 28 to 70 f2. Whew, that's a lot of numbers right there. But yeah, the IBIS works well, the shutter curtain works really well and really nice, and especially works to your advantage as well. So yeah, overall it's just great. And the buffer on this camera is also quite nice. You will not really run out of buffer unless if you're just, you know, gonna be, you know, holding your finger like that the whole time, or if you're just using a much lower read and write card speed. So yeah, that's when you will actually fill up the buffer quite soon. But in normal general situation of photography, I find that the buffer really holds up, and the writing speed is also fast enough, albeit of course not as fast as the CF Card Express. CF Express card, yeah. But overall, it is still a great performer. Now, moving on naturally into the autofocusing system, because we just came from the frames per second and the buffer, so it's really worth talking about the autofocusing system in this camera. The autofocusing system in this camera actually got better over the years with different firmware updates, of course, and you know, it's very sticky. It never really let me down, and to be honest, in my personal experience, at least compared to the Sony system that I'm using, is that it is better than the Sony system when it comes to tracking subjects with different contrast level. What I mean by that is with Sony, even though with Sony the autofocusing system is very sticky once it's like it finds the right subject, but with this camera, when the contrast level gets a bit more tricky, this is definitely more accurate and more sticky than the Sony system for those subjects. So yeah, just take it with a grain of salt. It's just based on how I shoot, which is mainly portrait and sometimes travel photography. But all I'm just saying is when you're actually photographing in tricky, contrasty environment, the autofocusing system on this camera is going to be, you know, much better than something like the A7 IV. So just keep that in mind. And also the A7 IV might seem more like sticky within the LCD or the viewfinder, but in terms of accuracy, this actually beats the A7 IV by miles. So yeah, that's just pretty much my experience with the autofocusing system in this camera. The autofocusing system on this camera is not only good when it comes to tracking, but it's also good when it comes to focusing in low light, because in low light, this camera, I find that it's so much more accurate than the A7 IV. The A7 IV might find or detect the subject a bit quicker in low light situations. And of course, I'm not trying to compare these cameras, but I'm just, you know, having a point of reference from another brand to this camera, since a lot of people like to, you know, have some sort of benchmark. But even though this is not like a solid benchmark, but it's something that I can just, you know, visualize for you guys that, okay, the A7 IV is really good at detecting subjects, especially in low light as well. But even though this camera isn't as fast as like identifying certain subjects in low light as the A7 IV, but once it actually detects, it's much stickier and it's much more, like much more accurate than the A7 IV when it comes to tracking in low lighting situations. Likewise for super blown out situations as well. So yeah, depending on the situations that you shoot in, whether it's super bright sunny lighting situation or super low lighting situations, of course this camera might not always detect the subject as quickly as the A7 IV, but once it does, it's more accurate and it's definitely stickier as well. So that's something that I personally much prefer, because it's nicer to just come home knowing that the focusing confirmation is more accurate and most of my images are actually more focused than, you know, let's say the A7 IV, for example. And yeah, now onto the next topic, which is the connectivity. The connectivity on this camera, well, either the Bluetooth or the Wi-Fi is actually really nice on this camera. I really love how fast it's able to transfer the raw files onto your phone, and it's just very reliable as well. Once the camera finds the phone or the phone finds the camera, the connection is very stable as well. And of course, if you just want to maximize the speed, just make sure your phone is really close to the camera, but otherwise it's still really fast transfer anyway. But you can also still really reliably shoot, well, tether shoot with this camera through your phone or other mobile devices as well. So what I like to do sometimes is actually photograph seagulls. So I sometimes just put the camera outside the balcony or outside on the windowsill and just control the camera wirelessly on the phone. And you know, the wireless latency is actually pretty nice. It's not too laggy, so I can always predict in time when to hit that shutter button. And to me, even though it's not really a feature that I use professionally, but in many professional environment or professional scenarios that I can think of, you can actually still use this professionally as well. And you know, even though the latency is there, it is good, as I mentioned earlier, but having a strong stable and reliable connection, which this camera does offer, is really nice as well. So yeah, despite me only using it just for kind of like personal projects, I really think that the wireless and the Bluetooth feature can be used in a professional environment as well. And talking about image transfer earlier, if I just can go back to that, with the Canon EOS R6 and R5, I find myself shooting actually more and more images because it's able to actually deliver more images within a shorter period of time compared to, let's say, the E1DX or the 5D Mark IV. So yeah, with that more results I'm able to get, I'm also just able to deliver more sample results to my client right after the shoot, and then they can just visualize how it would roughly look like before the final edit would be delivered, so that they would actually have something to show to their families, to show to their other clients as well, or just show to whoever it might concern. So yeah, it's just a very nice feature to have on this camera. And now onto my kind of last hardware point, which is the internal preamp. The internal preamp of this camera, personally, I find it quite nice. It's been a huge improvement compared to the 1DX line of cameras and also the 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV line of cameras. It's really a nice preamp in here. Of course, it's not the best, and it's nothing compared to, let's say, an external professional preamp from like an external recorder. But to be honest, I've used this in so many professional environments, and the preamp is just really nice, and you can just get by, especially if you're just doing a normal interview. Whether it's indoors or outdoors, the preamp is just a nice preamp to really use with, and can really save you a lot of time if you're too lazy, or if you just have a lot of projects at hand to focus on, that you can just rely on the internal preamp to just work and deliver really nice results. So yeah, there's that. And now onto a more software related point. Canon, as usual, has a very nice and very organized and efficient menu layout, and that is something that I can confirm with this camera. Despite so many more features that this camera adds compared to the the R, the RP, and previous cameras like the 5D Mark IV, 5D Mark III, things like that, but the menu system on this camera is still really nicely arranged, and with a nice touchscreen that Canon has implemented in here, you can actually access the menu much quicker as well, whether it's in the actual menu or just the quick menu on the actual display itself. It's really quick to access, and it's really efficient, and yeah, overall it just gets the job much easier done, and also much efficiently done as well, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's no complaints really. So on the software side of things, I really quite like it. The only gripe I have when it comes to software and kind of hardware point about this camera is I really wish that once the screen is flipped out like this, the sensor here would be deactivated, and not having to go into the menu and deactivate the sensor. Because obviously when you're vlogging in a very tight environment, or if you want to set up the camera in a very tight environment, sometimes the camera could be just up against the wall, and it's still best to have this camera, the LCD pointing at you, so you can actually frame the frame nicely, or actually have a better clue of how to frame things. But if the sensor here is on, then the screen will of course be switched off. And I know that some other brands, their sensor is actually automatically turned off if the screen is in this position or in this position. So I really wish that Canon would actually come up with some sort of firmware updates to just have this feature enable within the software itself. That's just pretty much the only gripe I have about the software on the Canon side on this camera. But otherwise, everything is really efficiently laid out, and everything is just really fast and, well, fast to access and just logically arranged, just like other Canon cameras, of course. So yeah, there is that. Now over onto the image quality. The image quality on this camera is really nice, as I mentioned earlier. Yes, it's only 20 megapixel, but to be honest, 20 megapixel is more than enough for example, what I do, and it really allows me to print up to A1 really nicely. And by printing up to A1, I mean like, one of those super fine photo print, and not just a random poster A1 print, but yeah, really fine detail A1 print. This camera really delivers it really nicely, and the rendition between the highlights, the shadows, from tones to tones, it's all very smooth, very detailed, and very pleasing. And even though it's not my favorite Canon color science, that is still the original 1DX in my opinion, and also followed by the 5D Mark III. But the actual color rendition is still very nice and smooth, and you can actually get a lot done with the color science out of this camera. The color reproduction, the color depth is also just there. It's really nice, and yeah, I just really don't know how else to explain it. It's so smooth and it's so natural in the same time that you can actually also manipulate it any way you want, and it will just behave any way you want it to behave. Unlike using my Fuji cameras, the yellow aren't always reacting nicely, the greens, the reds, things like that, they're always like it feels like it has its own mind kind of thing. But with this camera, and also nowadays with the Sony cameras as well, it really behaves really nicely when you just try to manipulate them, and even if you don't manipulate them, it's really nice. I once did a shoot for a client, and it was accidentally set on JPEG, simply because the day before that shoot I was shooting something for eBay, and obviously I didn't want to, you know, have such a large file for eBay, because I didn't really want to spend time converting and, you know, lowering down the file, things like that. So I just shot everything in JPEG, and I forgot to change them back into RAW. So the next day when I had my shooting, everything was in JPEG, and that goes the same with the R5, which I'll talk about in the R5 video. But the JPEG file out of this camera is also very robust. So even if you accidentally just shoot JPEG, the file out of this camera, the image file out of this camera, is still really robust and just hold up to a lot of post-processing as well. So yeah, that really says a lot about the image file and also the image quality that is coming out of this camera, despite being only 20 megapixels. And of course, naturally, if you only want to, you know, upload the images onto your social media, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, what have you, or even if you're a news journalist, you know, having to print for the newspapers, well, 20 megapixel is way more than enough, to be honest with you guys. You can even do extreme cropping with 20 megapixels. The only time you will see a huge difference is, of course, if you're working with, let's say, 8K or 5K monitors, and if you do a little bit of crop, you might start seeing certain details or certain roughness, because you're also magnifying into that crop as well. So yeah, just keep that in mind, that in most cases it is more than enough and it is really fine. It's just that in some niche cases it might start to show its limitations. So yeah, take it as what it is, but overall it is really nice. The moire and aliasing control on this camera is also very nice. Though I did have one viewer of mine that kept commenting on every single of my video, well, not every single, but like on a lot of my videos, saying how he pretty much said that yeah, the R6 has the worst Canon color science and also has the worst moire and aliasing, which, you know, respect to him, to that particular viewer. But for me, like, the 5D Mark III, 5D Mark II has a much worse moire and aliasing than this camera. And even though my favorite Canon color science is still the original 1DX, but the Canon color science coming out of the R6 is really nice according to my personal taste and experience. And of course, it doesn't seem as dull as, let's say, the Canon EOS M50. So maybe it's just my thing, and maybe it's just something that's also very subjective. Well, it is subjective, but yeah, I wouldn't really go as extreme as saying, you know, has the worst moire and aliasing or the worst Canon color science. I just like to make that clear from my side that to me personally, it is still very pleasing, and the sensor readout is still fast enough to really eliminate a lot of the moire and aliasing as well. So yeah, that's just something from my side. But if you have something else to share that's different from my experience, then by all means just share your experience, share your stories down in the comment section below as well, because I would also just like to learn more and also know more about other people's experience with their R6s and what they think about it. But otherwise, in low lighting situations, the sensor is also a very nice sensor that performs really well. Naturally, being a lower megapixel count than the R5, it is going to outperform the R5 in almost every way in low lighting situations. The details are hold up better. The dynamic range in low lighting, well, when using higher ISO, will also hold up a tiny bit better than the R5, in my opinion. Not too much better, because the dynamic range on here is just really good, just that in high ISO situations the noise is a bit more pronounced with the R5. Of course, with something like the R5, with such a resolution on this camera, you are able to just trade in some of the resolution just to clean up the noise a little bit more. But, you know, having said that, Adobe just announced the AI denoising feature that actually works wonders. So you don't really have to care a lot when shooting with higher ISO on this camera. But if you're not using Adobe and if you don't like editing your images, you still can comfortably use ISO 4000 unless if it's super low lighting situation where any noise will be visible, then I wouldn't go above 3200. But you know, in 4000 ISO, at least in my experience, it still holds up pretty nicely. Now, I do shoot a lot of portraits, which means in low lighting situations with the lenses that I have, I never really had the or at least in most cases, I never really had the opportunity to shoot over ISO 2000 or ISO 2500, which is still pretty much a sweet spot where you don't really see a lot of noise. And if you do see, it's just a nice texture, and it also adds as a nice character to the image as well on this particular camera. So yeah, I guess that's the advantage of shooting, let's say, with the f1.2 and f2 lenses, things like that. So yeah, just, you know, keep in mind on what you shoot. But yeah, otherwise the ISO performance is actually really nice on this camera. So yeah, now over to the video side of things. Onto the video side of things, I did use this camera for some of the professional shoots as well, but I also used this camera for a lot of the personal shoots. So before I started using Sony cameras for some of my vlogs, for some of my videos, I mainly just used the Canon EOS R6, and you've seen the footage coming out on, like, you know, shooting on the streets in Bangkok, things like that, quite a few times. And also some of my camera my thought videos were also filmed with the Canon EOS R6, and to be honest, the overheating did perform just fine. Like, it never, well, I never really had to worry too much about the overheating at all, really, to be honest with you guys. And also the color science is also very nice. The skin tones, the skin rendition is also very nice. And I really like the fact that they actually add the C-Log 3 into this camera as well. The bitrate is also good enough to actually edit C-Log 3 with the files, but in the same time, I also find that with the neutral color settings, the neutral color profile, well, picture profile of this camera in normal video mode works fine as well. Actually, to be honest, just to save time, I just shoot everything in neutral picture style and just do a bit of color editing, color correcting later in post, because I already really love the color rendition, the skin tones out of the Canon cameras. And especially with the skin tones, I don't always have to, you know, color correct or color edit just like with other camera manufacturers like the Sonys, like the Panasonics, because with those manufacturers, the skin tones are really horrible, especially when you're shooting videos, well, both video and photography really. But with this camera, it's just, you know, it just performs really nicely as well. So no complaints about that. And for some people, it might be limiting not having 4K 120, but to me personally, having 4K 60 FPS is, you know, more than good enough in this camera. Now, I would like to actually touch briefly onto the autofocusing system of this camera in video. In video, the autofocusing system of this camera is actually very nice and accurate, but also understandably a bit slower than in photography, not because the capability is not there, but because it just wants to make it more natural and much more smoother transition between different subjects. Therefore, it is a tiny bit, just a hair bit slower than in photography. But of course, it's something you can actually get used to and just play with the settings a little bit, and also just work around with the camera a little bit if you want it to be faster or a bit slower or a bit smoother or what have you. So yeah, there's that. But I also really like the fact that the touchscreen on this camera actually works wonders, because that means you can actually rack focus really quickly and smoothly with this touchscreen, and also with the autofocusing system in this camera. Something that I can't really do with, for example, my Sony a7 IV that's filming me right now, because the touchscreen is so bad. I cannot really rack focus as conveniently or as quickly as with the Canon. Because I also know that at the end of the day, the Sony can do that, but because of this screen that it's so bad when it comes to, you know, wanting to rack focus, I just cannot achieve that with the Sony. So yeah, there's that. But otherwise, back to the video quality, I find that the video quality is really nice and detailed, and the 4K HQ on here is also very good. And especially if you're shooting here in Northern Europe, where you're not, you know, constantly in the heat, unless if you have one of those heat waves in summer, then, you know, this camera can actually perform really nicely without the overheating sign popping up, at least in my opinion. and also in my user experience. But of course, you know, sometimes when I'm shooting in places like Thailand, and if I'm shooting for a very long, extensive amount of time outdoors, then it's easier for the overheating sign to actually pop up. And, you know, at least I have the luxury of switching cameras, but I know that if you're only using this camera as your one main camera, that can be a bit of a problem, especially when you're working under tight schedule. So just keep that in mind. But otherwise, if you don't care about shooting in 4K HQ and you can just shoot in normal 4K, that will also just get the job done. And to be honest, you won't really see that much of a difference if you're just posting it on your social media like Instagram, YouTube, and what have you. So yeah, in that sense, you can actually get a lot done to like barely having that overheating sign popping up actually. So yeah, there is that. But otherwise, moire and aliasing on this camera in video mode is actually really well controlled. So I really like the fact that I can actually shoot a lot of fine patterns without a lot of moire and aliasing showed up. So yeah, I just really love. That being said, it's also not perfect. It's not 100% perfect. Depending on the compression, depending on the situation, depending on the environment, it still can show up just on a very minute level that you might not notice. But in the same time, it's definitely workable. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the video side of things on this camera. Now onto the conclusion. Well, to conclude, I really love this camera. I find that it's a camera that can do everything, whether you want to tether shoot it wirelessly, whether if you want a really nice fine print out of the camera, if you want really smooth rendition, very detailed color reproduction, yet has really good color depth as well, and also a camera that has very good dynamic range and also shoots really fast and also has a very, very reliable and accurate autofocusing system. I find that this camera is a great camera. Of course, 20 megapixel might put a lot of people off, but just to remind you, 20 megapixel is also not that low actually, and couple that with all the other reliable features that this camera has to offer. It's a camera that you can really take this camera to so many places because of those features, but also because of how well it's built, how tough it's built. The environmental sealing on this camera is just great. Not to mention that this camera is also light, you know, just light to hold, to have in your hands, and also, you know, small minor features like soft shutter that this camera is designed to have. It just makes this camera a very nice camera to just have as an all-around camera to just, you know, take it with you and photograph whatever situations there is to photograph, you know, regardless of where you go. So yeah, it's a very easy camera to fall in love with as well. And of course, as I mentioned several times now, it's not the king of any particular field, but it's just a camera that does everything very nicely, covers everything, but it also delivers everything very well. So, you know, unlike those cameras like the 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IVs, where I think the saying goes like master of none, jack of all trades, or jack of all trades but master of none, things like that. I don't know the real saying, but this camera is just like those, just that it takes it on a higher level, if that makes sense, because the reliability, the quality that this camera offers is just so much more than those cameras that, you know, you can easily get by with pretty much most situations with just this camera, and you can just rely on it. And that is something that I really love about this camera, whether it's the build quality, the environmental sealing, the fastness of this camera, the efficiency layout, whether it's both on the hardware wise or on the software wise. It's just great. And I also love the anti-flickering mode, which I'm sure, well, yeah, I think it's been introduced even way before, since the DSLR-H, I think around 7D Mark II maybe, I'm not sure. But yeah, a lot of features in this camera that you will just fall in love with, and you will just forget that it's a technical camera. It's one of those cameras you just use and not having to deal with a lot of flaws or a lot of issues. It's just like you see something happening, or you're going to your job, you just take the camera out and shoot. It's not really in the way. It's one of those cameras that you still feel very much connected with what you're shooting, so to speak. So yeah, I would really highly recommend you at least try out this camera, because it is such a great camera and it will get a lot of things done quite nicely, and especially when the prices are, reducing dramatically nowadays, well, decreasing dramatically nowadays, it's just, you know, at least worth a try, because I think you might actually fall in love with this camera. And also, you know what, I actually much prefer the mode dial out here, well, up here, than the actual mode switch here on the actual R5, because on here it's just one button and then you have to move the dial, and then you'll see on the top screen which mode you're in. It's just a little bit cumbersome sometimes, whereas on here, if I just want to switch between photography and video, I can just switch with the actual mode dial out here, well, up here, which is really nice. And yeah. Otherwise, there's not really much to say apart from what I've already wanted to say. Of course, again, this is not a full review. I haven't covered all of the features of this camera, but out of all the things that matters to me, whether it's handling, ergonomics, operational side of things, image quality, everything has been pretty much set. Oh, and also the viewfinder on here is actually quite nice and big as well. Of course, it's not the biggest, but in the same time, it's big enough that it's very, very comfortable to always, you know, rely on this viewfinder. Not only in terms of the refresh rate, but in terms of the size itself, that, you know, your eye just won't really get tired of looking through this electronic viewfinder. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say about this camera. And yeah, if you have any stories to share, any recommendations, please also feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. If you have any questions, also feel free to ask me in the comment section down below as well. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. The link is down in the description section below. Just click and download. I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense, so you don't need to submit any email address or anything. So yeah, as my throat starts hurting since this video is longer than how long I wish it would be, I would like to end it here. Thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.